Hi, Bonnie. Nice to see you again.
Hi, nice
So,
to see you.
yeah, and these are strange times. And you just mentioned that your dogs were barking outside, and I've had issues with my kids, and we're sort of struggling onwards and trying to do our work, which at the moment is a conversation. Um,
Yeah,
Now we're going to come on to wrote a wonderful essay called "A Tale of Two Systems," and what COVID or Corona reveals about the two systems. Before we get into that, I want to just give people some context about you and where you're coming from and your background a little bit, because we can get very deep in the thickets of this sort of theorizing, and we will. But first of all, my sense is that your epistemology, your kind of the way you orient yourself towards knowledge of the world is a little bit different. And part of that is because some of your life experiences. So can you just run me through a little bit some of the main elements of that? What makes your perspective a little different from others, maybe?
yeah, it's an interesting conversation. So if you just know me because you've read some of my works, especially some of the academic works, you might get a certain profile of who I am. That work is really hard for me to do, and I know you watched me struggle through writing this article. Yeah, so what is more in line with who I am is how I live. I live on a farm in Northwest Connecticut. I experiment with what you might call permaculture. I'm not a permaculturalist. I like to see how I look at the world from the lens of like dynamic participation, even of inanimate objects. I'm always trying to translate the lived experience of holistic participation into whether it's systems thinking or psychology or metapsychology. I'm someone who always checks the concepts against my own lived experience. I teach that way. I've been a Taoist practitioner for a long time.
What does that mean out of interest to be a Taoist practitioner?
Well, Taoism is an interesting um, religion, you could say, but it's a modern system. And that is, so in Taoism, you're really working with energy and form, and you're taking things quite naively. Like, if you're interacting with an animal or a plant, and you're having some kind of affection for it, you just take this for what it is, that the plant or the animal or the natural world is in resonance with you. You don't over psychologize it. You don't get into projection. You take for granted. It's kind of a what you see is what you get. The earth is supplying us with food and sustenance. The sun is the source of energy.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to go looking for some kind of cosmological principle for why we are alive. It's all basically, if you're receptive to perceive what is, then you can see the Tao, the orders of the universe, the way things work. And it's not a naive system. It's a system by which you validate these knowings through embodied participation. And so I call myself actually a lazy Taoist, because once you get to see how things work, you're like, wow, I was just in the way all the time. Like I'll teach relational dynamics or emotional balance with horses. And one of the things people realize is that they're lonely, but they're actually, the whole world is falling into relationship with you all the time, and we've been pushing away. So it switches, and you start to see that you can parse your life with the universe. This is the lazy Taoist. It's always like, well, easier for me. Or if you're in a boardroom, let's say, your tendency, if you're facilitating, is to do too much work. You're always trying to, you've brought these people together. But once you understand the way human systems work, you can see, this is going to move over there. And you just tweak a little, and then the system rearranges itself. So there's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of space in between which to act, but you're not controlling. You're just kind of amplifying. And I'll tell you a story, for example. I've been doing landscape design build. I've been doing it for 33 years, and we've built fabulous biodynamic organic gardens for the rich and famous. But they were always so much work. And I was like, how can people actually produce food? like every tomato required so much work if you weren't using pesticides and stuff. And we use organic compost. Then I bought this farm and I started kind of doing the same thing, and we were growing tomatoes and, the usual, and it was just so much work. And one day, after 3 or 4 years here, we have horses, so we had this big compost manure pile in the back, and I went to the other side of it. And there were huge tomatoes growing like naturally in all these squash fields and stuff. And I thought, wow, there's a lesson here, And so we ended up, what we do now, what we were doing is we were using third-year compost, which is really beautiful. It's beautiful mulch, but it's dead.
Right.
And I'd always been told not to use fresh compost, but we use first-year manure, spread it on the fields. We throw all the old tomatoes in squash there. I had squash growing up trees.
Right.
I have tomatoes that are like big as people. And so it's this, we have really lost the ability to understand the potential in the living world. And we keep going in the opposite direction. Everything, for example, that climate change is telling us, instead of fighting it, it's like, what is it telling us about how the system operates? How can we move into that intelligence and into that knowing? So this is kind of what a Taoist, Taoist kind of questions that you have. You work with the world as it is, as opposed to, let's say, a Buddhist who wonders if the world is real. Right. And then they're like churning that for like their whole lives, right? You see?
I mean, yeah. I mean, lazy Taoist, I thought of book titles like Trying Not to Try and the principle of wu-wee and not getting in one's way and that kind of thing. I like the idea of being a lazy Taoist, and the lazy Taoist and the large tomato would be a great short story.
Yeah. I just want to highlight this. I just got this for my birthday, and it's a print by this wonderful artist, Jenny Baird.
Right.
And it's really something that at this stage in my life, it was a fantastic present, because this is a really good illustration of my inner sense of self. And
okay.
Yeah.
I can see that. Huh. That's almost like your alter ego behind you there, or
yeah.
Right. Yeah. Great. And the horses, you say you look after them like on a daily basis, or are they just there?
So I take care of 6 horses and 13 acres of gardens.
Wow.
And ducks and chickens, and the dogs, I suppose, they take care of me in some sense.
Right.
And so me and my partner of 32 years, although he has full-time job. So yeah, it's a lot of work, but there's so much return in it. Like if I'm working on a conceptual or metaphysical problem, something very highly complex, I get most of my insights scooping poop.
Right.
And I'm doing a series of collective insight workouts, and we're working with evocative objects. So if you have an intention to solve a problem and you relax and you look at the natural world, something will instigate an insight. Like Kirkle's, what's his name? The guy that solved the structure of the carbon.
Right.
Hercule or something. The rumor has it he was in a bubble bath, and like the Buckminster Fuller's, the bubbles took the shape of the carbon. So it's not a labor of love. It's actually a way to participate in which you actually receive more than you give. And there's so many. Wow, I could go on forever. I know you just asked it as an introductory question, but I just give you one more way in which being present to the living world is useful. So we have hawks, and you love the hawks, and we have owls, and you love the owls, but they eat your ducks, right? And so there's this beautiful way of constantly asking your question about life and death. Mm-hmm. Because you can feel yourself, and this is maybe something going on in the CV pandemic thing. You can feel yourself, well, which side do I take? And you have to get to the point where you see that you feel yourself having to move to a bias, to take a value. And so you start to release that.
Right.
And then the pickle is no longer irritating you like a pickle. Something else starts to brew from that position. But it's difficult.
Right.
You know, I tell my friends who want to get into chickens, I say, don't give them names. Because if you give them names, you will suffer. Because that's the first point of, you know.
Attachment and identification, all that, Okay, so that's really useful as a setting, because there is something different about your contribution, and that makes some sense of why. The lazy Taoist who gets most of her best ideas while she's scooping poop and making big tomatoes, often at the same time. It's fascinating, because the reason it's fascinating, as you know, Bonnie, is that in the sort of meta world of theorizing, it can be hyper sort of pseudo-rational at some level, because it's so heavily laden with conceptual analysis that it often feels unreal and untethered from our ground in some sense. But you're walking the talk of that, and your epistemology is embodied in a way that it may not be for young guys living in cities, guys like me living in cities. The next thing I want to ask you, if you don't mind.
Can I push back there a little?
Sure.
Because you wrote a book about chess. I mean, you would think the moves that matter, you would think, oh my God, how conceptually disconnected could that be? But your orientation to it was, what is this reflecting back to me about life?
Sure.
So, you know, I think it's this posture of participation, even the way you embodied some of the pieces. And this is what I'm saying, you know, like, I don't want to give people the impression that you have to go back to the lander. I see a lot of resonance in the way you let chess and let that enter in and be porous with your imagination to get insight. So I just want to reflect that back to you.
Well, thanks. No, I hear you on that. And I think some people have been a little surprised by that, because the book was presumed to be about sort of thinking and winning. And really, it wasn't primarily about that at all. And so that, for some people, that was confusing. But for those who got it, like you, they really got it. So I appreciate that. So yeah, like you say, so participatory knowing, a kind of embodied knowing, to some extent embedded. So the piece you just wrote, you speak about two systems. We call it a tale of two systems. I think best to begin with just, what are those two systems? How do you write them?
So over the last 3 or 4 weeks or 5 weeks, you know, I've been watching a lot of people, so a little bit of mainstream news, not much, but there's a lot of discussion on the fragility of the system and all this conversation. And something was really not settling in me. I mean, I think I told you it was driving me batty.
Yeah.
And I always pay attention to that. Like, what is my irritation? And then even some people that I really admire in the complexity theory space seem to be sliding context somehow. I started to see there's like a context. Yeah. And these things are not easy, especially when the news cycle and all this stuff is happening so fast. And so it took me a while to actually I had to make the distinction in myself. And that is, there's two systems. There's big centralized systems that are, under some conditions, seem to be efficient and robust, but they're actually above a certain threshold of complexity. They're fragile, and they're doomed to perpetual catastrophic collapse. Mm-hmm. Then there are systems, which I don't even like calling them systems. We can get into that later, but it's kind of complex. But there's systems that are holistically, dynamically interconnected. Mm-hmm. They don't look like systems because they're not bounded. Mm-hmm. You know, there's a lot of fluid. It's very Taoist. It's a lot of fluidity, a lot of interconnections, a lot of movement, a lot of ability to shift and change. These are what we could call distributed autonomous systems.
Mm-hmm.
The agents and their participation is central, and the system emerges, the shape it takes emerges from all these complex dynamics of relating.
Mm-hmm.
So in the discourse around coronavirus, these two things started to get mixed up because we have on the one hand the governments and the financial markets and the financial system and the big antiquarian healthcare institutions on the one hand, and we're feeling not only watching how like incompetent they seem, even if you are happy with what they're doing, it's a bumbling kind of thing. And so that's happening, but we're forced to stay home. And people are thinking, wow, we're all interconnected. They're starting to help each other more locally. They're getting on the internet and having these fireside chats. And I started to realize that in the discourse, people were moving between those in ways that the distinction was falling apart. So they would say, yeah, look, the coronavirus has us all. That's how we're connected. And I'm like, no, the coronavirus is part of this big multimedia institutional healthcare problem. It's also part of industrial agriculture. It's actually not the way we are interconnected and our immune system is healthy. So, and then I didn't want people to conflate, the media, there's a subtle manipulation when the media is conflating this sense of interconnectedness with the coronavirus and the pandemic and the whole big system failure. Those all sit here, and they're symptoms of big system failure. The return to this need for interconnectedness. A lot of people are baking bread and going back to these hearth and home things. This is the other system, the deeper ancient system trying to come alive again. Right. It's not part of this system.
Right. Yeah, just to be clear, so I mean, this is a heuristic and a guide to what's going on. So it's not really a once and for all map of reality, but you're just drawing attention to a feeling you had and how to parse it in a way that makes sense of the current moment, not to conflate the eco-social, localized emotional response with the kind of economic, industrial, political response, which are part of the same experience but need to be distinguished. No, I think I understand that clearly. It makes good sense. But what I wanted to check in with you about is that some would say, look, these lovely things that are happening, people rediscovering baking and lighting fires and putting things on each other's doorsteps and checking on the vulnerable and remembering they have neighbors and all of these things that ought not to have been that difficult, should have been there already, but it's being rekindled somehow. Mm-hmm. Some would say, look, the risk here is that we lapse into a kind of eco-romanticism, that we lapse into a kind of, wouldn't it be lovely if there wasn't this big industrial monster out there? Can't we just live simply again? Mm-hmm. You're not saying that, but tell me why you're not quite saying that.
Okay, because if you understand complexity science, you understand that above a certain level of complexity, distributed, this isn't Dave Snowden's work, it's in Nord Bateson's work, it's in what Jordan Hall is saying, this is highly researched, that above a certain level of complexity, the resilient ecosystems, the resilient systems have these other characteristics. People have been talking about the fragility of the financial market for 30 years because of this. It's been predicted. Mm. The big centralized ways of doing things have been shown to be headed for catastrophic collapse by scientists, by complexity theorists, by people like Stuart Kauffman. All this recent research is very robust. It's mathematically chartered. Mm-hmm. So what I'm saying is that eco-romanticism is also scientifically valid, right. And it's not surprising that it is.
Okay. Right. So it's sort of in defense of, not a non-naive defense of eco-romanticism, something like that. And also, you remind me, Bonnie, the distinction you make between the two systems seem quite close to the distinction between complex and complicated systems.
Yes. So these words don't really work anymore because the market is not really a complicated system. It's quite complex. Our interventions are complicated because they're let's solve one thing at a time.
Right.
So we're lacking a language. So I like to call it complex systems versus holistically dynamic ones.
Okay.
But still, this is not settled. There's a lot of conversation about in the complexity world about really what these systems are. What's a chaotic system? What's a liminal system?
Right.
Dave is introducing a lot of terms. So yeah, I wouldn't say the market is complex because what we like to say is a complicated system is more like an airplane. Yeah. You can take it apart and you can't really take the market apart.
Right. So, well, again, just to be clear, though, I mean, I hear you on that. I suppose I was thinking more that the resilient systems you were pointing towards that were relatively localized and kind of post-indigenous or something like that, they were relatively complex, whereas the centralized, bureaucratic, fragile systems were relatively complicated. But you were saying even that doesn't really quite work. And that's partly because of the way that they permeate and are embedded in everything,
yeah,
including the other system, yeah.
I would just say mostly the difference between centralized, the power, the agency, the information. If you think about, does the average person know what's actually going on? No. The power to move the markets, to make those decisions is very centralized. Mm-hmm. The power to spin the media is very centralized. Now, we live in a time where there's also this decentralized movement. So someone like Carl Weick, for example, he's a research scientist around sense making. He studied, for example, the avian flu, Legionnaire's disease, all this. He showed that anecdotal evidence, although it was equivocal and contradictory and not always right, got to the answer faster than the CDC's stubborn, professional, robust research into what the avian flu was. And it was because there was something, I don't really understand the biology, but there was something unprecedented about what was happening. And theoretically, that was impossible. So the way they were looking at it made anecdotal evidence seem impossible.
Right.
But today, you see, like the doctor that came in from New York, and he said, this respiratory symptom is not like those respiratory symptoms. And years ago, you could have never come out publicly and said that.
Right.
You would have been wiped out your whole professional career.
Right.
But there is a lot of movement in this direction. The thing is, like I've been curating my Facebook page, and it's very delicate because even though I think I have like people with wide awareness, it's very clear that they'll only sanction some they don't want too much anecdotal evidence. They don't want many perspectives, and then you get kind of like yelled at if you put something that's a little too much this way. And it's an interesting exercise in how much ambiguity and information, and I don't just clickbait things. And a couple of times people give me a heads up and I take them off. Right. But this is actually a good sign that there's a distributed collective intelligence that's actually moving the needle, and that is threatening to this big, large society. Now, people who watch TV and are ordinary ways that they get the information, like my mom and my sister, they just see the same thing we did in the 50s, just the standard centralized kind of document. But there's some hope because there's some like percolation of information. And there's like Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying, his wife. They've been doing a podcast because they're both biologists, and they're showing up not as experts, like they know everything, but they're showing up as people who can digest some of the anecdotal evidence, follow its path, and give a reason. Yeah, so this to me is like a whole new kind of anchor of a society that's trying to emerge.
Yeah.
And if you don't understand those two different systems, like this is, you'll just see how that's anecdotal and it's
okay.
Yeah.
I do understand. I mean, it's a strange place to take the conversation, but I'm just reminded of when my second child was born, Vishnu. That night, for what it's worth, there was a full moon, and when we got to the clinic, what surprised me, we got to the hospital, and all the midwives were saying, "Yeah, lots of women are here having their babies because the full moon." And they said it as if I was like, "Hang on, we're in a scientific establishment here, you know. Surely that's not the way you're making your judgments." And I think the way they held it was quite lightly. It wasn't as though there was no sort of causal inference or deduction, but it would be wrong equally to sort of disregard it as irrelevant or pseudoscience, or it was still part of the data set. And it wasn't held as the exclusive truth, but it was held as a kind of something to be aware of in the context. Because it was extraordinary. You know, there was like we expected 1 or 2 people and there was like 30 or something. And anyway, I hear you on that. I suppose I want to ask you then, you know, what is the right attitude to anecdotal evidence? You know, how does one find the right kind of epistemic antenna to relate to good and bad anecdotal evidence?
So for me, it's like a little bit like a war zone in the media right now. So this is the problem. So on mainstream TV, you will see only videos of hospitals being overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on the internet, you can see they've taken a lot of videos from Italy and used them as if this is happening in New York.
Right.
Okay, so that's the only thing you see. You don't see, for example, my sister works in a hospital. They're laying people off because no one's going to the hospital for like elective surgery. There's nothing going on. So this is not information. This is just cutting a certain slice of reality and broadcasting it as if it's the whole.
Right.
Now, there are people that are walking around boroughs of New York trying to get into the hospitals because they see nothing's happening and they see the nurses outside. Now, this is not sanctioned in our society, and they, you know, the authorities come and won't let them do that.
Mm-hmm.
Is the fact that my sister's hospital is less active than ever before anecdotal? No, it's not anecdotal. It's a fact.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fact. It's part of the whole to be considered. Mm-hmm. But it's not, it doesn't make it into the information ecology. And so that means that it's being manipulated, which means it's, you know, if you don't want to call it propaganda, then it's like manufacturing reality or something. Mm-hmm. Here's another example. I don't know where people are getting their death statistics in the US from. Worldometer has it up to like 27,000 or something. And where the go-to place for death statistics in the US is the CDC.
Just to be clear, CDC is?
Center for Disease Control. Right. It is the go-to place for statistics in the US. The CDC has deaths from COVID listed as 9,000. So where's the other numbers coming from? Even if you say, well, the CDC does say they're 4 or 5 days behind, which is certainly not justifies that because they're more careful. Mm-hmm. But my point is where the other numbers coming from? Mm-hmm. I mean, Worldometer. What's Worldometer? So it's like, these are not anecdotes. What I just said about the CDC is not anecdotal. I don't take a screenshot of the CDC. I give people the actual link. You can go do the parameters yourself. Yeah. And so this is like not just anecdotal. I know I use that term myself, but they're not irrelevant parts of the information ecology.
But you're holding them with a certain degree of epistemic agility, which allows you to sort of see them and yet not hold them too tightly somehow. That's maybe quite a high level cognitive achievement, right? It's not something that's that easy. Many people do want to see things as true or false, as relevant or irrelevant. rather than somewhat relevant in some context in relation to some other things. So it's difficult, I guess, to know how to advise on that kind of subject. But okay, let's come back to the premise of the piece. So I'm just thinking, you said something about the subtle manipulation that goes on where these two systems are conflated. And then you said, just be careful to create the right kind of mental model in your head for what's happening at this time. You've also said that eco-romanticism is, well, in response to the question of is this eco-romanticism, your answer seems to be a kind of qualified yes, in that you're saying, look, that could be seen as a slur and a lazy way of thinking. What you're saying is what people call eco-romanticism might be thought of as a kind of the relevance of indigenous knowledge to the present day and the hubristic failure to attend to it. It's something like that you're saying, right?
I think the word romanticism is a little got a lot of it's got a lot of wobble in it, because going back to working with complex, dynamic, distributed systems is not like living in a Disney movie. Mm-hmm. It's hard to work on this farm, right? So the romanticism doesn't mean it's some kind of idyllic type of existence. Right. But the romanticism may come from the fact that you feel at home again, So, and that without, again, so, we're not talking about Disney's version of Eden or,
Sure.
But what is interesting about what I find exciting or provocative, it's not like we're going back to the things we always knew. Mm-hmm. It turns out, I had this conversation with Jim Rutt about, the tomatoes growing in the food pile. It turns out we might not actually have ever known any of this categorically before. Right. We might have been a little more ecologically balanced just by embodied participation, that nature had ways to keep us in check. Mm-hmm. So we, in some sense, we are recreating like permaculture for the first time, because we didn't actually consciously know it categorically. Right. So it's, in that sense, it's not like going back at all. It's that, and that's why, I don't know if I should, the sixth thing is digital naturalism. Right.
Just to frame that for the listeners, so in the piece there were 6 main recommendations or guidelines or pathways, a way to learn from this moment in the right way, and the 6 are: expand our political and economic imagination, design a global commons in service to life, experience the deeper sources of connection, expand circles of trust and concern, reinvent education for the future, and pivot to digital naturalism. And we can take them in reverse order if you like. In fact, it's quite a good thing to do because precisely because of this fear that what you're saying is let's go back to basics and go back on the farm and everyone will be fine. That's not quite what you're saying. So digital naturalism, tell me about that in this context.
So there is a possibility, and I think this is true, that we've assumed that early man knew these things, and it's kind of a lost, I mean, there are some lost skills, but we won't go into that. But the whole category of how to be what Tom Chi would call net positive to nature. Right. Something that is not in our past, but it's on our horizon. Right. And I use the term digital naturalism. It's an emerging kind of field. Cool young people are doing it, but what they're doing is saying technology has given us the power or the tools. Now this is where, like, a lot of people will push back, not to make nature an instrument for us. That's what we've always done with technology. But basically it's like how I will be able to communicate with nature and listen to it, her, or it for the first time. And in that, I will start to understand my place. Mm-hmm. So, yes, you can harvest information out of that, how to feed ourselves. That's always part of it too. So I'll give you a simple example. It's very trivial, but the Native Americans used to say, the prairie dogs call the rain. I got this little factoid from Charles Eisenstein, and then I researched it. So that's like a going back to a mythological understanding. And then in the 50s or 60s, there was a drought in the Midwest, and the ranchers were complaining that their cattle were competing with the prairie dogs for vegetation, and it was a drought. So the federal government started an extermination policy for the prairie dogs. And it turned out the drought got worse because it happens to be true. The prairie dogs' system of underground tunnels created a microclimate that created rainfall.
Wow. Gee.
Okay,
right.
So that's one anecdote. But now what happens is there's young people that are interested in prairie dogs again, and they use technology to listen to their chirps. And it turns out they have quite a sophisticated way to communicate, and they communicate to other species in the prairie that are part of the ecological behaviors of the prairie that makes the prairie work. And I use this slide where when you look at prairie dogs, the little families of prairie dogs, I talk about empathic projection. If you perceive them in this like Taoist way, you can see that they're more interesting than they're just not just pets. Like you can use your heart to empathically project how you're the same. And in that, you ask certain questions. But only technology has enabled us to understand how they communicate.
Right.
So there's this beautiful connection potential for something like empathic projection, which is in our pro-social needs, which is very ancient, and this power of technology to allow us to communicate. And if you think of the whole history of humans and animals, like we have horses, they do all kinds of things for us, or dogs. Mm-hmm. Our animals have been able to come very much into our world. They understand our language, the habits, mm-hmm. the way we live, Now, how many people can move that far into a horse's world? We don't have the possibility to communicate the way we take for granted many of our species do. Mm-hmm. We don't know how to enter their worlds at all. They know how to enter ours. So this question of, and every time I say this, people bring up that movie Arrival. Mm-hmm. Like, are we smart enough to enter into the language of nature? I think this has been hard for us. Mm-hmm. Because our language symbolic centers are generalists. They're reductive. They reduce information.
Right.
The language of nature is very particular and precise. And so we need AI. We need digital tools that can handle that amount of precision in order to feed us back patterns that we can understand. We're actually quite coarse in the way we communicate. So that's what I mean about digital naturalism. For me, it opens up a whole new economy and educate. We've been starving as a culture to figure out what are we going to do next. It's always been it's always been answered in the shape of another war on climate, war on drugs, war on this, war on poverty. This is one of the first truly very large. In my article, it's like the moonshot. We choose this. And then within that vision, all the particulars of things we want to do, revitalization of the earth, renewal of education, all these things are possible from within this one moonshot. And so for me, I hadn't thought of this one until I went through this process with coronavirus, and like this whole process of living with my irritation. And I knew young people doing the digital naturalism. For me, it was like off my radar. But as I started to like parse out these moves that we could do as a society, taking advantage of this time, that's where a lot is moving, and there seems to be a lot of wiggle room. I went back and did some research, and it started to really live in my imagination as this capacity. So you can see I got excited about it.
Yeah, no, I can. And I haven't fully processed a response yet, because it was new to me too. I suppose it made me think of eco-modernism initially, which is a sort of different school of thought that says, ecological crises can be framed as a sort of the luxury one has after economic progress, and that somehow the first priority is to feed people and give them jobs and develop, and then you have the technological wherewithal to solve your ecological problems. But of course, many people kick back against that and say, on the contrary, the drive for technological mastery is what causes the ecological crisis. This is something different, though. I feel the heart of this is educational, and it's also it's almost like it is a little bit extraterrestrial, right? It's something to do with AI as a kind of ET, right, at some level. But not just that. There's something about rediscovering what we've forgotten, and like you say, coming to know ourselves better through our limitations, using technology as a form of translation,
Yes.
as a mediator between us and the natural world. Because realizing that while we think we're part of nature, and we are, there's also a meaningful sense in which we're not. So I'm very intrigued by the idea of digital naturalism, and we can come back to that because it's a new terrain. Everyone has to learn something about it, but I can see that at its heart, it's kind of has a lot of promise and hope to it. I can imagine a lot of people though who feel a certain horror of it's like, it reminds me of Ghostbusters, Don't Cross the Streams. It has that feeling of like, don't bring these things together. They don't belong together. But on the contrary, maybe that's the next necessary evolution.
That's why it couldn't penetrate my imagination, because it seemed like a violation. And this I had to come to terms with that. And my friend who started that other website, they call it Digital Naturalness, right, but it's all in the same field. But they would say, he and his colleague would say, well, AI's here anyways, we might as well make it useful. And I hated that, because it's like me, I don't want to like give in and stuff like that. But what I realized is like, and again, this is like mental models for people who, the part of the work is, I realized that we've only been violated by AI. Like people have a smartphone and they think it works for them. But if you really look at it, we work for the smartphone. Sure. And so there's some knowing in us that technology's always been instrumentalized, except for like instruments, like musical instruments. But in general, AI, we have this sense that, yes, don't get AI too close to nature because it's going to exploit yet again. Of course, this is always the problem. But instead of saying that, it took me a while to understand how can we use AI and not instrumentalize it. And then I saw that video I showed you, and it was more like Avatar, like it actually, they want to try to communicate, and you see the life in the kids come out. Yeah. Because they can exercise their abstract quality. Yeah. And it was just really, was an inspiration to me.
Bonnie, it gives a whole new meaning to the term digital native, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and because I know with my own children, there's a sense in which they do orient slightly differently, obviously, to technology, because it's just it's part of the ecological niche that we're living in, not something exogenous and exotic that came from outside. And it's also very intriguing vis-a-vis the commons, which is another of your sort of ideas, that somehow we've got to design a global commons in the service of life. Now, in your piece, I don't think these things are very directly connected, but it occurs to me when you're speaking about digital naturalness or naturalization or
native,
whatever we decide to call it. I was thinking of what Zach Stein might say about the back end of this, like the measurement and the ownership of what's happening from the AI data as you measure nature and get to know it better and learn about your own limitations through that. A key question would be, is there a digital commons to go with the natural commons and the social commons? Is there even an epistemic commons and a spiritual commons? Like, where do we draw how do we sort of make sense of these interconnected domains in a way that allows us to confidently go there, or imagine that we could even ever do that?
First, I want to say that I have tried to, the article, we could have put so much complexity in it, so this is not parsed out, but I tried to create a scenario that could run in parallel with the existing system. So you wouldn't have to get rid of big data
Mm-hmm.
in order to start doing digital naturalism. So all of these, I thought, could be like a culture that emerges in parallel with the existing system. And as we said, this is already happening. You know, the fact that you can have anecdotal, quote unquote, evidence on the internet, or people don't realize when PayPal first came out, people just don't realize how extraordinary it was.
Yeah.
Up until then, the SEC, Security and Exchange Commission, would never have allowed something like PayPal to exist, but these are huge openings, right? So I tried to continue to reimagine the transformation of society, not as a big revolution, but as something that gains momentum from within until the old ones, as they are obsoleted, then, you know, just like the passing of a generation. So two ships passing in the night.
Right.
So the digital commons is like that. The digital commons, what do I mean by that? If we go to more distributed, so it starts with the economy, but if we go to more distributed supply chains in a citizen's currency, you'd have to have a platform, a digital platform, to track all of that. The information has to be accessible to everyone. It wouldn't, so instead of going only to like big pharma or whatever, and then you'd have to have people with fiduciary responsibilities to collate that for average people. But this is not hard to do.
Right.
So we need something that exists without, you know, you can use the same infrastructure, but there has to be a hard wall between the for-profit advertising infrastructure and this infrastructure. Could be a kind of encryption.
Right.
So these things I'm trying to say, I'm trying to give people the sense that they're in process already. They don't have to, you don't have to wait till the whole big system dies.
Right. There's two things. So first, just on a point of clarification, then I've got a bigger question. But by citizens' currency here, it sounds like two different ideas at once. It sounds a little bit like what something's called UBI, but you're also speaking maybe of something like a localized currency. What do you mean by citizens' currency exactly?
Okay. In my opinion, there's a real big problem with UBI.
Right.
Okay. So
let's hear it. Let's hear it. Let's get it. Why not? No time about the present.
Whatever.
Yeah.
So UBI. The problem with UBI is every time the central banks inject money into the system, you owe them more. Mm-hmm. Okay? So, and if you owe them more, then you accelerate the extractive economy.
Is that necessarily true, or is it merely true in terms of the way it's currently structured?
It's true in the way it's currently structured, but it's almost impossible to get out of that structure for very sophisticated reasons. And so, again, a lot of people are trying to solve that. This is why I'm saying, why don't we have something in parallel? So we don't have to change that. And I don't want to go into the economics of it, but you know, if you read David Graeber's Debt, or Charles Eisenstein has some simple examples of why that's the case.
Right.
It's actually not solvable, even by the people who are running that system. They don't know what they're doing,
okay.
But we don't have to solve that. But this is what UBI actually does. You see an article today. Now the feds are saying that people who owe debt can put liens on the UBI, on the stimulus check that people are getting.
Right.
So you basically, the way it works now is the government going to give you money in one hand, you're going to end up, you or your children, paying more in the other. It's just, it doesn't, when I get my UBI, the incentives for how to use money in that system will be perverse the way I use that money. It's just the incentives.
I am aware that there are many detractors.
Yeah.
I wasn't putting it as some kind of panacea. Just that it's good to, you know, it's always curious to know where people are coming from. I know many others who are extremely skeptical because it's often presented as if it was a sort of necessary and sometimes even sufficient condition for many other things to happen. But of course it creates its own problems. I do wonder, however, just last thing on this question, you know, optimally designed, with the underlying principle that people need a modicum of economic security to engage in social and civic life, to learn, to go and do those things in the woods that you want them to do, whatever it is, with universal coordination of banking reserves. My instinct would be there must be some way of doing it. But maybe your point is that could be utopian. There's always some way of doing something. You just can't be sure how it will be in practice.
Yeah. So I'm not saying, again, don't do UBI. I'm saying, let's do this other thing, introduce this other thing also. Yeah. And we could start with, now, so let me just give you my vision. And I know the pundits out there are going to say, there's a million reasons why this is not the case. That'd be interesting to see if that's true. But so instead of UBI, I call it a citizen's currency. You could be a world citizen. I think there's still reason to make it nation state related, right, for many, many, reasons. You have a citizen's currency. It's very similar to what kids do already. Like kids, they go to restaurants and then they just, I pay this time, and they're just having a in-group accounting of who pays what. So instead of and then maybe at the end of the year, I owe you $8, you owe him 10, but he owes me 12, and then, in the end, you have to reconcile like $1, $1.50. Right? So now, can you feel how that threatens the mainstream economy? Because in the mainstream economy, only $1.50 gets booked.
Right.
And so that taxes on it's only $1.50, profit that, but it's in that direction that I'm talking about, the way this currency works and why it diminishes the extractive opportunity.
Right.
The more extractive opportunity something has, the more efficient you have, you get on the rat race. So if you had, for example, start with the citizen currency for the food supply chain, okay, the food supply, then you would have, right now, we don't have a food economy to feed people.
Right.
The food economy feeds the economy. Right. And as a consequence, people get fed. It's right. So the decisions are always, or even let's say it's a balance. You want to serve both masters.
Right.
The complexity in the economy makes it way too complex.
Okay.
We want the food economy to serve one thing, to feed people.
Yeah.
And to do that, you need an exchange currency. You need tracking flows. We want that mechanism money greases the wheel of the flow of goods and services.
I understand. Yeah, I think I understand that. I suppose I wanted to just kick back slightly because, if you take a mortgage, for example, it's true that for every pound or dollar you borrow, you pay back, at least another one. And yet, during that time, you have a secure place to live and you're investing in capital. And, it's not necessarily a win-lose. There's a sort of win-win aspect to it. Likewise, in principle, UBI might incur interest of sorts, but it doesn't follow that that's not worth it for the security conferred by it.
Yeah. But there's a real question for me. I was working on it today. I actually don't see everything going to a citizen's currency. I think that things like, value-added capital, which is your house, basically should be. I mean, some people just sell it. They flip them now. But there are things that I think do better in this kind of current way of understanding interest and debt and value-added and liabilities. Okay, so that it may be that they complement each other. I don't see everything going to this other thing, but we don't know.
Okay.
But for example, I would say start with food, and once you get going, and there's so much possibility that it brings. Like, so you'd have citizen currency, you would buy your food with this, and then at a certain point, if there's overproduction, there's too much currency in the system. And so you basically, instead of having governments pay farmers not to plant crops, you take that currency and you create multi-stakeholders investment in the land. So
Right.
it's put aside,
Right.
and it's backed by the land that's not under production.
All right.
And then when you need more, it moves the other way.
Okay.
That's all it does.
Okay.
But it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And so that's just one little thing. But I also thought like healthcare should be the same way.
Right.
You know, and the problem with healthcare today is you're not paying for healthcare. I mean,
Right.
I had healthcare for years. Then I lost, you know, typical US after the recession. I left my job. I lost my healthcare. Then I got injured really badly by one of my horses. I had to have 80 internal stitches and 40 external stitches and x-rays and antibiotics and this and that. That cost me $1,930, and they gave me 10% off if I paid within 10 days. Right? It would have been $60,000. All the rest is extractive value.
Right. Right.
All the rest is like just bullshit, basically.
Yeah.
So we've, you know, there's an illusion that health care is complex. There is a certain amount of complexity in it. Basic surgery. I have all my friends are vets. We do surgery here on the farm. All these things. There's an illusion of professionalism, an illusion of complexity. They could all be distributed. They could be monitored. People could, for example, we could use this citizen currency to pay for healthcare. Yeah. People could join like we do the National Guard. You could be medical service technicians. You'd have to spend a week, you know. Right. My arm was actually stitched up by a medical surgeon who had done 2 tours in Iraq. Because without insurance, I couldn't afford the surgeon. Right. And he said, my mom was a nurse. She was very nervous, and she started grilling him when she found out he was an MD. And he said, ma'am, I put them on and I've taken them off. Right. You know, meaning arms, you know. Yeah. I said, please don't forget which one you're doing.
Yeah. Sure.
You know, so there's so much richness in the human system that our current system actually represses.
Right.
And then we have on the other side, young people starving, perfectly capable of doing this kind of service in the world. So